Welcome to the One Advantage podcast, exploring the intersections of peer power, culture, and agility. Your hosts, Mike Richardson, Jason Richmond, and Leo Bottary, co-founders of the One Advantage community of practice and advantage peer groups. For more information, please visit us at the One Advantage podcast.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the One Advantage podcast. You can see already, if you're watching the video, that we have a very special guest with us today, Tonia Ries from the Edelman Trust Institute, who Leo will be introducing momentarily, because today we are going to talk about disrupting distrust. Guys, whoever came up with that title, I love it. I love it, love it, love it. Disrupting distrust is what we're going to be talking about today, because it is so important in today's business world. We're going to continue the conversation from our last podcast. If you remember, we talked about the Edelman 2023 Edelman Trust Barometer and the 4 forces affecting trust: economic performance and expectations of future income, institutional balance, mass class divide. Can't wait for that one. And the battle for truth. That's going to be a good one too. But as always, before we get started, I want to know where everybody's been and what they've been up to. Let's start with you, Jason. Where have you been?
Well, I got out of the cold, Mike. I'm down in the U.S. Virgin Islands right now.
Oh, nice!
I decided it was time to get out of the cold. But no, just again, like every week, it's been client engagements and a lot of executive coaching work these last couple of weeks, and more focus on culture, right? Just helping organizations deal with evolving their culture all week long.
Yeah, we just got started on a new project, didn't we? That shall remain nameless, but we're excited about that project we're doing together. So that's awesome. And Leo, you're here. It's always wonderful when Leo's physically here, Tonia, because he rarely is. He's all over the place all the time. Where have you been, Leo?
Quick trips to Charlotte and Indianapolis next week. This coming week, I will be in, I'm not even sure. A couple of cities. It's on a need-to-know basis, typically. So good.
Somewhere else that isn't here. And I haven't been anywhere this last week. I have stayed here in snow-ravaged Southern California. We even got snow at the house here. But that's enough of that nonsense. Let's get down to business. Disrupting distrust. Leo, we are so excited to have Tonia here as our guest today. Would you be so kind as to introduce her?
I would. We thought it was especially important to bring someone here who actually knew what they were talking about with regard to the Edelman Trust Barometer. So we thought we're real excited about that. So we have with us the Global Executive Director of Intellectual Property for the Edelman Trust Institute. Tonia serves really as the steward of the Edelman Trust Barometer, a study that's conducted in 28 countries across the world since 2001 on public trust in institutions, government, business, media, and NGOs. It is an extraordinarily well-respected study by all sectors. And if it's a study you're not paying attention to or really haven't heard much about for whatever reason, I invite you to really start paying attention to it. Go to the previous studies, start looking at the incredible work that Edelman does, not only in this area, but of course, as a global communications firm. It's hard to find a multinational firm better out there. But, we wanted to discuss the 2023 numbers, Tonia, because, as we were talking about it, we kind of felt that the results were rather sobering. When we talk about navigating a polarized world, as you describe it. By the same token, on one hand, you talk about this institutional imbalance, the idea that people see business as being competent, ethical, and government as being a bit of the opposite, about incompetent, unethical, which I would imagine poses challenges. Poses challenges, right, for not only for CEOs in the workplace, but by the same token, maybe some tremendous opportunities as well. So I guess just to get us started, if you could just offer some general comments on that, particularly as it pertains to the workplace. And I think for our listeners, eventually I want to get to, and I think we all want to get to, what can we all do? What can our role be, as individuals to make a difference going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the transformation of trust in business I think is really the most remarkable story coming out of the Trust Barometer over the last 3 or 4 years. And to me, one of the most stunning findings of this year's report is that we now have 3 years in a row seeing the ethical score for business increase 20 points over the last 3 years, right? Business historically has been, at one point for most of the trust barometer was sort of seesawing with government as to which was the most trusted. We've seen government drop off. We've also seen a lot of questions around NGOs and, do NGOs really have the ability to make a difference, have an impact, and get things done? And so with this increase over the last 3 years in business now being seen as not only competent and the most competent institution, but also ethical and nearly as ethical as NGOs, right? Just 3 points difference between the two. That's hardly anything. So there's been a real change, and I'd love to hear, a conversation among this group around why do we think that change has happened. Certainly business has gotten good marks for how it responded over the course of the pandemic, right? We not only brought innovation in terms of the vaccine invention and distribution, but we also brought a lot of innovation in terms of the services and help people get through the lockdowns by delivering goods in new different ways and empowering business to be done virtually. But I wonder if there's more to the story than that as well. Right? Because at the same time that we've seen this shift in the business ethical score, we've also seen a huge rise in the expectation that both consumers and employees have for business to really do more and have a bigger, broader impact, and be more serious in considering the impact that it's having across different stakeholders. So I think there's been sort of a general change that people are recognizing that CEOs are listening to those expectations and heeding those demands to provide both, from a consumer perspective, more purpose-driven brands, greater action on issues such as climate or treatment of employees. But they're also responding to what employees are demanding in terms of, people want jobs that are allowing them to have societal impact. In a way that perhaps was true for millennials, but I think the new generation of employees that are coming in are really seeing their ability to act through institutions, right? By putting pressure on brands, putting pressure on their employer in a way that we haven't seen in previous generations.
Yeah, Tonia, I just jumping in there, my opinion on that question of what, this 3-year trend, think about the enlightened awareness, the spotlight that's been on corporations through social media, through websites like Glassdoor, through quiet quitting, through all these trends, all these things have been happening. I don't think it's an accident that organizations are being viewed at a higher level of competence and ethics. I think it is a reaction to deliberate actions internally to behave that way.
Yes, I think you're right. I think people are recognizing that CEOs are making the effort to step up and respond and engage with these issues.
Well, what I love too about looking at the Edelman Trust Barometer is because we have a history since 2001, now you start thinking about this. And I think what's even more remarkable about what Tonia says about business is that in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, trust in business they were in a rough spot. And I think that if I have this right, that starting about 2010, business started getting really intentional about repairing that. And I think did a lot of work around that. And it also may speak to this idea, and I think I may have seen this in the 2022 workplace study about trust being local. And people looking to our workplaces as that place where I think there's almost a certain hopefulness about wanting to have a trusted environment, a trusting environment there, and even people looking at their own CEO as more trustworthy than just CEOs in general, right? Because there's that familiarity, there's that piece of it as well. A little layer though, and a question I have around this that I think is interesting too, though, is if I recall correctly, even though there's this trust and understanding of business being ethical, and maybe the opposite with government, when the two of them are together, when they work together, business and government, public-private partnership stuff, people actually regard that as something that tends to be far more successful than anyone operating independently. Tonia, why do you think that when you take government in the way people think about it now, but you now combine it with a partnership, if you will, that it's looked at in that way?
I think there's a couple of interesting things to that, right? First, when we ask the question, who do you think, which institution is most expected to solve big societal issues, climate change, diversity, even tough things like immigration? People point to government as being the one institution that really has the scope to create the systemic change that we need in those kinds of areas. But I think at the same time, they recognize just how politicized the environment has become. And, I'm afraid government really has not done a very good job of showing itself to be competent at getting anything done. And so the combination of the two, right, bringing in the innovation, the know-how, the ability to deliver jobs and economic growth, right? And this is where I think the real sort of superpower for business is, right? I, as a citizen, or I, as an employee, have more power and influence over the actions of brands and employers than I do over what my government does. Right? Even in a democracy, we cast our vote once every 4 years, or maybe every 2 years, or even every year if you're voting in local elections too. But at the end of the day, how much of a difference is that really going to make, right? Either in the outcome of an election or in those government officials actually getting anything done. Whereas I can organize a campaign or a boycott of a brand, and if I'm smart about it, I can get headlines in the news right away. Right. And I can put far more pressure and really feel that my voice is being heard. So, business has both a bit of a blessing and a curse situation, right? You're incredibly good at being responsive and showing yourself responsive to your customers and employee needs, but it also means you've got a very long line of stakeholders that you've got to take care of, and often balance conflicting interests, because those stakeholders don't necessarily all agree with each other. And so it's both a superpower for business, but also puts businesses and CEOs in a very tricky position and at risk of being caught up in the polarization that we see across society today.
Mike, this may speak to agility really as well, because I don't think necessarily people see government moving, in a very nimble kind of way, right? So maybe that combination with business
exactly
alleviates that a bit.
Yeah, exactly. I'm loving this, Tonia. I think this is a very hopeful conversation. Obviously, we talked about this in our last podcast, and I did my best to sort of read through the report and try to digest.
You guys did a great job. I learned a lot.
but I'm finding you've put it in a sharp focus for me more than I realized, and I'm finding this quite hopeful, that perhaps, Jason, the pendulum is swinging back in the right direction. Perhaps business is no longer just mostly about profit. It is equally now about purpose. It isn't just about money. It is about meaning. And perhaps all of the great work that everybody's been doing in culture and communication and leadership is beginning to pay off. And I couldn't agree more with you, Leo, that, when you add the different chemistry that you get from business with the different chemistry you get from government and NGOs, maybe 1 + 1 = 3, and you do end up in a better place, more agile, more able to tackle systemic problems with systemic solutions. So this is a hopeful conversation.
It's hopeful, but I want to be very clear about one nuance that I think is important. It's not an either or. right? It's not either do the right thing or make more money. We
Exactly.
actually think that by doing the right thing, by being more engaged, by listening to your employee demands and meeting the needs of all of those stakeholders, you will be more profitable
Exactly.
and more
Exactly.
successful,
Yeah,
right?
we spend a lot of time talking about the and proposition, Tonia. So
Yes.
you're very much speaking our language, very much indeed.
I'm just curious. I didn't go back and read all the reports from when it started, but Tonia, you said that there's only a 3-point difference between business and NGOs right now, which is really nothing. Was there ever a time you remember where it was pretty equal across the board? I mean, corporations, NGOs, governments all had kind of the same level, or has it always been there's gaps in this thing?
Historically, for the first 19 of the 23 years of the Trust Barometer, NGOs were the number one most trusted institution.
Okay.
And then it got to where business was tied with NGOs, government kept falling, media kept falling, and now business is the only trusted institution. Even NGOs are no longer trusted. So yeah, it's a little bit the last man standing. And I do want to get back to Leo's point as well about the hugely important role of the workplace and the employer, because compared to all of the institution, the most trusted of all is my employer, right? So this starts to speak to the locality or the closeness of trust, right? People don't really trust CEOs as a class, but when we ask about, do you trust the CEO of the company you work for? The answer is yes. And even those who are the most distrusting, I can take people who are distrusting of every institution, are deeply suspicious of the media and the elites. And when you ask them about employer trust, that is the one place where there is still trust. It really is kind of a beacon of hope. It is also an island of civility, right? So in a world where we can't even have conversations about contentious issues without getting into, identity politics, people are more comfortable talking about contentious societal issues with their colleagues at work than with their neighbors in their community, right? They feel safer in the workplace. They feel that there's a greater a shared sense of the truth or respect for facts, and that people are less likely to resort to personal attacks and so on, even if we don't disagree. So it's the one place where we still know how to agree to disagree and still get along and still get the work done. And that is so important as we think about fighting distrust, fighting the divisions that are preventing us from coming together to find solutions or compromise, right? That is just such an important skill. And increasingly, we're seeing signs that employees want their company to be a model of civility and trust even beyond the workplace, right? In the local community at large as well, and to help model those kinds of behaviors. And, can we as employers maybe bring those skills back into the society at large as well?
Tonia, a few years ago, you talked about the importance of information hygiene, right?
Yes.
The idea that when we receive information and it aligns with our basic beliefs on something, that we are more likely to accept that information and spread that information without necessarily having vetted it first.
Yeah.
Are we getting better at that? Is there any indication at all that we're starting to vet these things just a little more carefully before we start spreading it?
It's funny. I was just digging into some of that data this morning, looking for signs of hope. If there is hope in that regard, right, in navigating this really complicated, changing media landscape that has left all of us scratching our heads about where do we go for trustworthy information, right? There are two areas where I would point to. Are people getting better at it? Older people, no. I think they're just checking out, and becoming less and less trustful and kind of less and less engaged with news sources and journalistic reporting. But among younger people and the youngest generation, it seems the data is actually showing an uptick in both engagement with news sources, with multiple news sources, right? So they're working harder to find good information, and an improvement in the kinds of behaviors that are going to get you to quality information. So looking at multiple sources, even looking at sources you don't always agree with, making sure that you're vetting something before you share it. So the numbers are still lower than I'd like to see them. It's about half who are doing it well, but they do seem to be going up. So maybe we're learning.
I'm kind of hoping that the increased number of millennials and Gen Zs in the workplace will help actually accelerate this process at a certain level, right? I think about the differences in how we were raised and what we were taught. As boomers, it was like good things come to those who wait. I think for millennials and Gen Zs, it's good things come to those who act. And I think they are willing to do. They want their voice heard. They want a level of transparency that I think is unprecedented when you consider, previous generations. And maybe I'm hoping that as that movement continues, as that generation continues to gain both strength in numbers and in power, if you will, in the workplace, then maybe there's a shift that's possible there that will be driven by those generations in a very important way. That's conjecture, I realize, but just any thoughts about that, or any things you're seeing with regard to that dynamic in the workplace?
Yeah, I think you're really onto something there, right? And I do think we're seeing a subtle shift from millennials to Gen Z as well, where I think both are equally interested in activism, right? They want to fix these problems, right? They want to address climate change. They have zero tolerance for unfairness in the workplace, right? Along any dimension. So they're both very motivated to solve the problems. I think, though, that Gen Z, the newest generation, is even more pragmatic about, let me use my power to pressure big institutions to take action, right? It's no longer enough that I go and recycle and take out, and sort my plastics, because that's a drop in the bucket. I've got to go get companies to change their packaging, right? I need to put pressure on the whole system to transform the way that they're, getting goods and services to me. And I'm going to vet, not only is, the actual product that I'm buying a green product, but tell me about your supply chain. And, they might even know about scope 3 emissions and things like that. They're really educated, right? And they're getting out there and making change happen at more of a systemic scale, I think, than even the millennial generation was doing, right? Millennials were sort of the first activists using the power of social media to organize campaigns, but it was more about individual action, right? Now, I think Gen Z is like, how can we change institutions? Which is a very interesting shift.
Yeah, that's a big aha. That's awesome. It's an awesome thought.
Yeah,
it really is. You think of the power of a generation, and all our generations have been powerful in one way or another. But that is fundamentally, that what you just said could fundamentally change not only the way we live, but the way we work, the way we engage our workplace in general for years and years and years to come.
absolutely. It was so interesting. We did a study last summer, and we'll be repeating it this summer, focused on sort of the next generation of influence to understand how Gen Z was changing our culture. And when we asked older generations, right, how much are teens and young people changing the world around you? One of the most stunning insights is that the highest changes that are being reported are, yes, they're changing how I shop and how I consume media. They are changing the workplace above all, right? Came out to be the highest response, which I think is stunning. They're changing how we
even when the millennials started, from the workforce, from individual contributors jumping into leadership, you've fundamentally seen different ways that organizational leaders led. They're going to go through another whole shift again when Gen Z gets promoted and gets put in these leadership positions. How they lead will be different.
Yes. In what way? What do you think, Jason?
Oh, I think there's going to be a higher level of authenticity, communication, trust if they hold to that same core that they have now. Right?
I hope you're right.
If they stay true to who they are and that belief system and that value system that they have now and take that into future leadership ranks, right? They're going to lead based on that same value system. The challenge is will that value system change as their career goes up, as they get families, if they get financial commitments, if they get, will there be a shift or not? It'll be a fascinating study and thing to watch in my world.
A future trust barometer will tell us the answer.
I think you have a.
I mean, does that make sense, guys? What I'm trying
I think you have a future fan. We all are future fans of the Trust Barometer. We'll be tracking it every single year from this point forward.
I think one of the ways in which the culture, is really continuing to evolve that this younger generation is so comfortable with goes back to something, Leo, that you were saying earlier about the peer networking, the peer power of trust, right, that exists. And I do think younger people are much more comfortable with sort of distributed types of influence and communication. Right. And we see the power of peer trust show up in our data in so many ways, right? Not only are people more trusting of those things that are local, that they can touch, see, feel, but even when you look at how communication flows in the workplace, right? When you look at people who are non-managers, the most trusted source of company information for them are their peers, other people who are not in management levels. Only when you get to a manager do they most trust their direct manager, right? And only when you get to senior management do they most trust the CEO to tell them what is going on in the organization. So there's a lot to think about for people who are doing internal communications and how do you cascade messages so that they're coming from different levels of the organization in a way that are going to be more believable and create sort of that peer groundswell of trustworthiness.
Yeah, it's such an aha moment for CEOs when I'll bring that up, because I will ask them, how many of you have employees who are not the most senior level people in your organization, but they're really influential with other employees, and every hand in the room will go up, of course. So it's like, well, why aren't we getting their input? Why aren't we making sure that they can be ambassadors in these sense-making conversations that people have anytime that we're going to have some kind of a new initiative, new policy change, new anything, so that we can all really work together and give it a fair chance of being successful. So it is, because we can get so vertical. We can get so like, okay, here's our senior VPs, here's our VPs, directors, managers, and how information is going to flow this way, with not nearly enough regard for what runs horizontally, through the organization. The other thing that I did want to mention that you brought up, and I'm hoping, so rather than just waiting for millennials and Gen Zs to further populate the workplace in order to make things better, I think there's a role, and I'll speak specifically to baby boomers who can stop shaming, stop the generational shaming with regard to millennials or Gen Zs, and about how they're entitled, how they're this, and how they're that, and how they're different. It's an amazing thing. Plato actually quotes Socrates talking about complaining about the next generation, how they were going to screw up the world. This is something that has been happening for hundreds, thousands of years, and I wish maybe we could be the generation that says, you know what, because to your point earlier, if Jason, if people actually hold on to the values that they have now and bring those forward, I think we stand a great chance. But part of them doing that is for us encouraging those values now, not trying to, tear them down or speak ill of that. I think the generations. I'm very lucky in that the work that I do in teaching graduate school for Rutgers keeps me connected to those generations in a way where I'm so impressed. I think it is so powerful. I think, what they're going to bring to the world. I'm actually really hopeful that they're going to drive a lot of that change that's going to be so necessary for us going forward.
Yeah.
Agreed. Wow, Mike, we're
Tonia,
right up against the end of time here.
We are.
I
was
could
just
go on for another 45 minutes.
we're going to have to get you back, Tonia, because we basically only started scratching the surface here. I was thinking of a nice way to say this. This was kind of the professional half an hour, whereas last time was the amateur half an hour of really understanding how broad and deep and rich this whole Edelman Trust Barometer runs, everybody. And as Leo said when we got started, if you are not paying attention to it, you really should. And I think, Tonia, if everybody just Googles 2023 Edelman Trust Barometer, it'll take them right there.
Absolutely.
I think you can get it as a downloadable PDF, everybody, I believe. And wow, all I can say is wow, Tonia. I feel so much more optimistic and hopeful and aligned with hopefully what we are seeing as a trend that, you know, whether it's CEOs or C-suite or leaders and managers, how they show up really matters, really makes a difference, and is moving the needle. So, Jason, Leo, final thoughts before we sign out here?
Thank you, Tonia, for joining us today and sharing insights to our listeners. I mean, it was invaluable conversation today. And I agree with Mike. I mean, aligned in what the One Advantage is doing, what each one of our individual disciplines are doing, the encouragement and the optimism, I think, is at an all-time high right now.
Yeah.
It's great
Leo,
stuff.
Final thoughts, Leo?
Well, just that, you know, I had the good fortune of meeting Tonia when she was on the Year of the Period podcast back in 2017. I hope we don't make it go so many years next time. But Tonia, I'd really like to invite you to give, you know, some final thoughts that you have that you'd like to leave our audience, and also where they can learn more about Edelman, the Edelman Trust Barometer, and anything else that you feel would be really helpful for our audience.
Excellent. Please go ahead, Tonia.
Sure. So as has already been said, feel free to Google the Trust Barometer. You'll find a full report that you can download and lots of additional materials. We also produce additional reports throughout the year on different sectors. So if you're interested in topics like healthcare, brands in June, or the workplace, which we typically do around Labor Day, you know, keep an eye out for those. And we're also always happy to share any data with anyone who's doing research or working on the topic. So don't hesitate to reach out. You know, I think it's a very exciting time for business leadership, for CEOs. It's going to take some courage, right, to always be able to stand up and maybe sometimes even be willing to take a few mud pies in the face. But if we all stay core and true to our values, right, and the values that are core to the brands, the businesses that we lead. And so that's what we really, I do think, need to spend some time thinking about what those core values are, who are the stakeholders, what are our obligations to those stakeholders, how do we balance that? And above all, if we can do our part to restore a little bit of economic optimism, right? A lot of people are going through a tough time right now. So, you know, when we talk about engaging and solving problems, we're really talking about, in many cases, very concrete bread and butter issues for families and for local communities. So trust starts at home. So let's start there and build on that.
Awesome. So beautifully said. Wow, what a great one. This episode was one for the ages. I'm sure we will come back to it time after time after time. There we are, everybody. Another episode of the One Advantage podcast. Please come on back and check us out next time. We will see you then.
Thanks for listening to the One Advantage podcast. If you liked this episode, please consider helping us by rating us wherever you listen, spreading the word, having us as a guest on your podcast or webinar, and mentioning us in social media. Find us at the One Advantage podcast, where you can get more information about us and this episode. Thanks again for listening, and we look forward to more great episodes to come.